Hey everybody, today's video is called Here Comes Jehoshaphat, and tonight we continue our pass-through study here in the book of 2nd Chronicles, looking at the 17th chapter. We're going to be looking at the features of Jehoshaphat's reign. So, chapter 17, verse 1 through 4 starts out, Then Jehoshaphat his son reigned in his place and strengthened himself against Israel. And he placed troops in all the fortified cities of Judah, and set garrisons in the land of Judah and in the cities of Ephraim, which Asa his father had taken. Now the Lord was with Jehoshaphat, because he walked in the former ways of his father David. He did not seek the Baals, but sought the God of his father, and walked in his commandments, and not according to the acts of Israel. So King Jehoshaphat prepared the nation militarily for any aggression, particularly from the northern kingdom of Israel. And the reign of Jehoshaphat happened between 873 to 848 BC, and we see is covered later on in chapter 21, which we'll hit on right before I leave for Kentucky, most likely. But you can find the King's version of this passage back in 1 Kings chapter 22. So if you want to take a look at that, go back and find that video, or I can send to you as well. Jehoshaphat, he was most likely not just king straightforward. He was co-regent of his father Asa between 873 through 869 BC. And because of Asa's illness, as we saw in our last chapter, at the beginning of his reign, there continued to be hostility toward the northern kingdom, which was ruled at that time by Ahab. And the Baals is the term for idols. And in the chronicler's presentation of the history of the kings of Judah, the chronicler is constantly bringing contrasts and the challenge before the readers of his day and our day. In verse 5 and 6 it says, Therefore the Lord established the kingdom in his hand, and all Judah gave presents to Jehoshaphat, and he had riches and honor and abundance. And in his heart took delight in the ways of the Lord. Moreover, he removed the high places and the wooden images from Judah. So we see here that Jehoshaphat was obedient to the Lord. And we see that he goes on to remove the false worship from the land. And don't take what we see here by itself. Don't get your hopes up high, because we're going to see the removal of these pagan idol sites as temporal. And we'll cover that in our study next week in chapter 20, verse 33. And I know some hate spoiler alerts, but sometimes I just gotta put it out there. And God, he promised to take care of David's descendants' security if they had sought him first. And because Jehoshaphat trusted God, God lifted him up and God exalted him as king. Because we know that God's way of exalting us is when we humble ourselves. And as his heart delighted in the ways of the Lord gave him the desires of his heart, like David said back in Psalm 37, verse 4. And some argue that verse 16 has a contradiction with 1 Kings 22:43, which says that Jehoshaphat did not remove the high places. Verse 6, we see it says that he did. So is this a contradiction in the Bible? What we must see is there are two kinds of high places in the land. One of them is idolatrous purposes, and the other was consecrated to God and were used before the temple was built. And he took away the idolatrous, not the consecrated temples, high places. In verse 7 through 10, it says, "And in the 3rd year of his reign, he sent his leaders Ben-Hail, Obadiah, Zechariah, Nathaniel, and Micaiah to teach in the cities of Judah. And with them he sent the Levites, Shemaiah, Nathaniah, Zebediah, Asahel, Sheramoth, Jehonathan, Adonijah, Tobijah, and Tobadonijah, the Levites, and was with him Elishama and Jehoram the priests. So they taught in Judah and had the book of the law of the Lord with them. They went out throughout the cities of Judah and taught the people." In verse 10, "And the fear of the Lord fell on all the kingdoms of the lands that were around Judah, so they did not make war against Jehoshaphat." And so Jehoshaphat sent out teachers who taught the people the law of the Lord. And his spiritual strategy accomplished its intended purpose, invoking God's blessings and protection, much like it did with Abijah back in chapter 13 and Asa in chapter 14. And it should be noted that the Jews needed animals for extensive sacrifices uses as much as for food and clothing. And when we see the book of the law here in verse 10, it likely included the entire Pentateuch, but definitely included the book of Deuteronomy. And these teaching priests here were mentioned before back in 2 Chronicles 15, verse 3 by the chronicler. In verse 11 through 19, big chunk for the rest of the chapter here, says, "Also some of the Philistines brought Jehoshaphat presents and silver as tribute, and the Arabians brought him flocks, 7,700 rams and 7,700 male goats." So Jehoshaphat became increasingly powerful, and he built his fortresses and storage cities in Judah. He had much property in the cities of Judah, and the men of war, mighty men of valor, were in Jerusalem. These are their numbers according to their fathers' houses. Of Judah, the captains of thousands, Abna the captain, and with him 300,000 mighty men of valor. And next to him was Jehoshaphat the captain, and with him 280,000. And next to him was Amasiah the son of Zitri, who willingly offered himself to the Lord, and with him 200,000 mighty men of valor. Of Benjamin, Eliada, a mighty man of valor, and with him 200,000 men armed with bow and shield. And next to him was Jehoshaphat, and with him was 180,000 prepared for war. These served the king, besides those the king put in fortified cities throughout all Judah. So verses 12 and 13, it indicates the massive wealth that developed under divine blessing, as well as the formidable power, military power. And Amasiah was a ready servant of the Lord. And this is particularly notable because he did it in an otherwise secular calling, and no one had to press him into service. No one had to seek him out of service, and no one had to look after him. And once he began his serving, no one had to lead him. And so to wrap up today's chapter, we see the chronicler showing personal spiritual commitment of King Jehoshaphat, and we see the blessing upon his reign, and we learn that we ought to seek God above all else. If you get nothing out of today's chapter, we always ought to seek God above all else. And I want to read a verse in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 6:33. It says, "But seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added to you." So God provides for us when we seek his purposes, when we seek God's kingdom and righteousness before anything else. And we saw that the spiritual strength of the kingdom where Jehoshaphat brought the word of the Lord to the people. And we see that the chapter ends with an international strength of Jehoshaphat's kingdom. And that's going to wrap up today's video. We'll see you next, as we're going to be looking at Jehoshaphat, Ahab, and Micaiah. So have a great rest of your evening. God bless.